The porch light above me flickered like it was struggling to stay alive, just like the last pieces of my marriage. I stood there with my suitcase, fingers numb around the handle, staring at the closed door that had just swallowed his voice. I don't need you anymore. I'm rich now. The words weren't shouted. They were breathed out, soft and certain, like he'd been rehearsing them for months. That hurt more than if he'd screamed. The night air felt colder after he shut the door. Even the crickets went quiet, as if they too had heard something unforgivable. I didn't cry, not yet. I just kept staring at the quiet house, the one where we'd painted the walls together, argued over curtains, dreamed small dreams that felt big at the time. Now he stood on the other side, free of me, like I had been a weight he'd been waiting to drop. The suitcase wheels scraped the wooden porch as I lifted it. The sound was too loud, like a final announcement that I no longer belonged there. I walked down the driveway slowly. Each step felt rehearsed, like my body had always known one day I'd leave this house at night. The gravel crunched beneath my worn shoes. Above me, the sky was wide, empty, a dark stretch with no promise of dawn. I reached the road and only then realized how quiet everything was. No cars, no street lamps, only me and the darkness, and the echo of his last sentence circling like a vulture. I pulled the check from my coat pocket, the one he'd thrown on the kitchen table with a careless flick of his hand. The ink was still smudged where my tears hadn't dried. He hadn't left it out of kindness. It wasn't severance, it was insult money. A cheap thank you for years I'd never get back. The paper fluttered in my hand as the wind tugged at it, almost begging me to let it go. But I held tight. Because something about it felt wrong. Not the amount, not the signature. Something deeper. Something that made my father's old warnings rise up in my chest. Never trust sudden wealth, Mayra. He used to say that without looking at me. Usually while fixing something. An engine, a fence, a clock he insisted still had life left in it. He was a quiet man, the kind who didn't waste words. So when he repeated something, it meant everything. Money that comes too quickly always takes something with it. I never used to understand. But tonight, as I stared at that check, I felt his voice more than I heard it. And I knew this wasn't sudden. This wasn't luck. This wasn't normal. Something had shifted before tonight. I just hadn't seen it. I wrapped my arms around myself as the wind grew sharper. I had nowhere to go, to no friend's house, no hotel, no safe corner of the world that felt like mine. Except one place, my father's cabin. The thought made my stomach twist. I hadn't been there since the funeral. The place still smelled like his old leather jacket and burnt coffee. Even in my memory, it was small, creaky, tucked between endless trees outside town, quiet in a way that felt almost holy. I hesitated for a moment. Going back there meant reopening all the things I'd kept locked up. Grief, unanswered questions, the strange fear he had of banks, the secrets he never explained. But I had no choice. I took a deep breath and started walking, my suitcase dragging behind me. The moon slipped behind a cloud, and suddenly the road was so dark I could barely see my own hands. Each step forward felt like stepping deeper into a different life, one I hadn't asked for. As I walked, the memories came in sudden flashes, like someone switching on old lights inside my mind. My father at the dinner table, voice stern. Mayra, don't take loans unless you must. And don't trust what comes too easy. His hands trembling once when we passed a billboard for a new bank in town. His sudden silence whenever money was mentioned. His habit of counting cash twice every time, like the numbers could betray him. At the time, I thought he was just old-fashioned. Afraid of change. Now I wasn't so sure. A car passed suddenly, a blur of lights and wind. For a moment, the headlights hit my face, and I saw myself reflected faintly in the window. A woman alone. A woman leaving everything behind. A woman who didn't yet know the truth waiting in her father's walls. As the darkness swallowed me again, I tightened my grip on the check. My father was gone. My marriage was gone. My home was gone. But his warning, his voice, that stayed. I didn't know why he'd always told me to fear sudden wealth, but I was about to find out, and deep down, beneath the heartbreak and the cold, a new fear grew. The kind that comes when you realize someone else knew. This moment was coming long before you did. By the time I reached my father's cabin, the sky was bleeding into dawn, soft gray swallowing the last of the night. The trees around the clearing stood like silent sentries, their branches still heavy with winter cold. My breath came out in clouds, my suitcase dragging through the frost-bitten grass. The cabin hadn't changed. Not the chipped porch step I once tripped over. Not the crooked wind chime made from rusted keys. Not the way the front door stuck before it opened. As if the house needed a moment to decide whether it wanted company. I pushed inside. The air was thick with dust, floating in the pale morning light like suspended memories. Everything felt untouched since the day we buried him. Untouched, yet waiting. I stood there for a moment, afraid to move, afraid to stir whatever ghosts lived in the silence. His old jacket still hung on the back of the wooden chair. His favorite mug still sat on the table, a ring of dried coffee circling the bottom. The smell, pine, leather, old paper, hit me so sharply my chest tightened. "Hi, Dad," I whispered. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the room. I placed my suitcase on the floor and sank onto his chair. Exhaustion seeped into my bones, settling heavy. For the first time since my husband shut the door on me, my tears came, slow, quiet, the kind that burned more than they fell. When I finally wiped my face, I noticed something on the floor. One board, just one, was slightly lighter than the rest. The wood around it darkened with age. But that one piece always stood out, like a secret trying to breathe. I remembered sitting cross-legged on this floor as a child, tracing that very board with my tiny fingers. My father had laughed softly and told me, "If you ever want to know the real me, Mayra, it's under there. My real life isn't in any bank." At the time, I thought it was a joke. Adults said strange poetic things when they wanted kids to stop asking questions. I never understood what he meant. But now, standing in his cabin after my husband's betrayal, holding a check that smelled of sudden money and lies, I felt the weight of those words like a hand guiding mine. I crouched down and slid my fingers under the edge. The board lifted easily. Beneath it, just as he'd said, sat a small metal box. Dull silver, cool to the touch. A thin layer of dust coated the top, but not enough to suggest decades, just years. As if he had checked it often. As if he'd been waiting for the right moment to open it again. Or for me to find it. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I unlatched the lid. Inside were three things. A faded notebook, edges frayed from years of handling. A small, unfamiliar brass key. And a bank card. A bank card I'd never seen before. Dark green, with a bank logo I didn't recognize. My breath caught. My father didn't trust banks. He never used cards. He paid everything in cash and kept his savings in jars, envelopes, old tobacco tins. But this card proved he did have something in a bank. Something he hid. Something he wanted no one to know about. My hands shook as I lifted the notebook. The cover felt soft with age. Corners bent from being opened again and again. I flipped through a few pages, scribbles. Dates, short phrases, numbers that didn't make sense yet. Receipts tucked inside from towns I'd never heard of. Names written only once, then crossed out. A date circled 3 times. But none of it explained the card. None of it explained the key. I picked up the small brass key and held it to the light. It was old, heavier than a normal key, rough around the edges, marked with 3 tiny letters scratched into the side. A place, perhaps, a company, a name. But I didn't recognize it. It didn't belong to the cabin, or our old house, or anything he'd ever taken me to. Why would my father have a key to a place I'd never been? Why hide it? Why hide the card? A cold shiver crept down my spine. I sat back against the wall, the box open beside me. My father's secrets spread across the floor like scattered pieces of a life I'd never known. He had lived quietly, simply, predictably, or so I'd believed. But this was a different version of him. A man who kept keys to unknown places. A man with a bank card from an institution he claimed he feared. A man who recorded things secretly in a notebook with no explanations. A man with a real life he never showed me. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe the exhaustion was making everything feel heavier than it was. Maybe the notebook would explain everything once I read it fully. Maybe the key was nothing. But the card felt like a stone in my palm. Heavy, wrong, connected to something my father wanted to protect or hide. I reached for the notebook again, planning to start at the beginning, when a sudden warning thought sliced through my exhaustion. If he hid it, if he hid all of this, then someone, somewhere, might have been searching for it. And if they knew he was gone, maybe they were searching for me now. I swallowed hard. My father's cabin was supposed to be a safe place. But as dawn crept through the trees, touching the floor in thin gold lines, I realized something unsettling. The cabin wasn't just waiting for me, it was warning me. And somewhere out there beyond the trees was a door this key belonged to, and a truth my father knew would one day find me. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I drifted in and out, listening to the cabin breathe the way old houses do. A soft settling of wood, a distant tap of wind against the window, the occasional sigh from the rafters, like my father was still somewhere in the walls. By sunrise, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the bank card between my fingers. Dark green, unfamiliar logo, no name printed on the front. Just a quiet, heavy presence I couldn't shake. My father had always been terrified of banks. He used to say that money kept in silence was the only money that stayed yours. But this card, this was deliberate, purposeful, hidden, and it was the only lead I had. So just after 9, I drove into town. The bank looked different than I remembered. Brighter windows, cleaner floors, the kind of shine that came from confidence. People walked in with purpose, their coats buttoned, their steps sure. I felt like an intruder stepping into a world I didn't belong to. The bank card warmed in my palm. My real life isn't in any bank, my father had said. Yet I was here, standing under fluorescent lights waiting for my turn, hearing his voice echo like a quiet warning. When the teller finally called me forward, she greeted me with a polite smile, the practiced kind, the one meant to keep everything smooth, simple, forgettable. Good morning. How can I help you? I slid the card across the counter. This was my father's, I think. My voice felt too thin, too unsure. Can you check the balance? She nodded, reaching for the card without suspicion. For a moment, everything was normal. Her fingers tapped the keyboard. Her eyes flicked to the screen. Her smile remained steady. But then, it didn't. Something tightened in her expression. Barely there. A flicker. Her shoulders stiffened. Her jaw shifted. She glanced at me, then back at the screen, typing again, slower this time. Just one moment, she murmured. I need to call my manager. A cold line threaded down my spine. But I only asked for... I understand, she whispered quickly, her voice too soft. Too careful. Please wait. She stood and for the first time wouldn't meet my eyes. That's when the quiet unease became something heavier. People didn't react like that to small balances, or old savings accounts, or forgotten debit cards. The room felt suddenly too bright, too open. The manager appeared within minutes, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a posture too, straight to be friendly. He carried the teller's unease in his eyes. Ms. he began. Mara Langford. Ms. Langford, he nodded once tightly. Would you come with me, please? No explanation, no smile, just a gesture toward a door marked private. I followed, the carpet swallowing the sound of my steps. The room he led me into was small, windowless, and cold, the kind of place meant for conversations people wished they could forget. He closed the door behind us. Please sit. I sat. He took the chair opposite me, placing the bank card on the table between us as gently, as if it were something breakable. This account, he began, has been under internal watch for a long time. Internal watch. The words felt heavy, official, wrong. I just want to know the balance, I whispered. He exhaled slowly. It isn't that simple, Ms. Langford. He turned the computer toward me, typed a sequence of numbers, entered a long hidden code. Then the screen changed, and I saw it. A number so large my breath caught mid-chest. A number impossible for a man who chopped wood for neighbors and fixed old radios for extra cash. A number that didn't belong in the life my father lived. This, I stammered. This can't be right. The manager folded his hands. Your father didn't just save money. He maintained a trust, one that has been monitored and protected for several decades. Trust, monitored, protected. Words that belonged to a stranger, not my father. Protected from what? I asked. His silence answered nothing but revealed everything. He leaned forward. Ms. Langford, did your father ever mention anyone who might have access to this account? Anyone who might come looking for it? My heart thudded hard enough to hurt. No, I whispered. He didn't even tell me it existed. The manager's eyes softened with something like pity. Then you should be very careful. Accounts like this don't go unnoticed. He paused. And they don't stay hidden forever. The room felt smaller with every breath I took. I looked at the numbers on the screen again, trying to force them to make sense. My father lived in a cabin with a leaky roof. He drove a truck that coughed every morning. He wore the same flannel shirt until the elbows thinned. Nothing about him matched this. What was my father involved in? I whispered. The manager's expression stayed still. I can't tell you that, but someone, somewhere, will eventually try to. A tremor moved through me, because beneath all the confusion and fear, another thought had begun to take shape. One I didn't want to acknowledge. If my father hid a trust like this, if he kept a key to an unknown place, if he feared banks yet entrusted one with this, then he wasn't the man I thought he was, and whatever life he lived in the shadows, it wasn't over. Not for me, not yet. The manager slid the card back toward me. I stared at it, afraid to touch it, afraid to leave it on the table, afraid of what it meant either way. Ms. Langford, he said quietly, whatever your father was trying to protect, he trusted only one person with it. I looked up. You. His words settled into my chest like a stone sinking into dark water. I slipped the card into my pocket, stood slowly, and walked out of the bank with the weight of a truth I hadn't asked for. Outside, the morning sun looked too bright for the world I had just stepped into. And as I stood on the sidewalk, the question I'd been avoiding finally surfaced. Who else knew about this account? And how long before they found me? The cabin felt different when I returned, as if it had inhaled while I was gone and was only now exhaling. Dust floated through the thin, afternoon light like tiny ghosts rising from the floorboards. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it, letting the quiet wrap itself around my shoulders. The notebook my father left sat exactly where I'd placed it, on the old wooden table, its cover soft from years of handling. It looked small, harmless, but somehow heavier than everything else he left behind. I knew one thing as I walked toward it. Whatever truth my father carried, it didn't belong to the daylight. I sat down and opened the notebook to the first page I had skimmed earlier. It was filled with my father's handwriting, sharp in places, shaky in others, dates, town names, amounts that made no sense. None of it looked like the man who taught me how to hammer a nail straight, who warned me against trusting sudden wealth, who lived a life so simple it bordered on invisible. The deeper I flipped, the more the entries changed. Coded phrases, circles around dates, due soon, don't let them find it, paid temporary. And then, halfway through the notebook, I saw it. A name, Alira, written gently, almost protectively, in the margins of 3 separate pages. My pulse slowed. I didn't know why the name made me stop, but it did. I whispered it out loud just to hear the shape of it.
Mayra.
It wasn't the name of any relative, not a neighbor, not anyone I remembered from his past. But next to her name were longer entries, notes written with a kind of urgency that softened the more he wrote. Safe for now. Her debt, my responsibility. Don't tell Mayra. That last line stung. I kept reading, each page revealing a different piece of someone else's life, someone my father had shielded in ways I never knew he was capable of. There were receipts from towns miles away, stamped with late-night dates and large withdrawals. Old envelopes addressed in a handwriting that didn't match his. A photograph tucked neatly between 2 pages, faded, edges curled. A woman with dark eyes, standing near a lake, looking away from the camera. Was that her? Was that Alira? The more I found, the more it felt like I had stepped into the middle of a story already in motion, one he'd spent decades trying to keep hidden. A single entry, written with what looked like a trembling hand, stopped me. They're watching again. I exhaled slowly, brushing my fingers over the ink that had bled slightly into the paper. Whatever burden he carried, it wasn't just emotional. It was real, tangible, dangerous. The night outside deepened, shadows moving like soft water across the windows. I barely noticed how dark it had become until the page turned black in front of me. I reached for the lamp but froze halfway. There it was! A sound, soft, measured, too slow to be an animal. Footsteps, somewhere outside the cabin. My breath caught. The cabin was far from town. You didn't just happen to walk by. Not at this hour, not on this forgotten road. Whoever was out there, they had followed me, or they had been waiting. I turned off the lamp with trembling fingers, trying not to make a sound. The silence pressed in around me, thick and watchful. Footsteps crunched closer across the gravel outside. One step, another, then a pause, long enough to send a shiver through my ribs. I moved slowly to the window, keeping low, peeking through the crack in the curtain. A shape stood in the dim light of the porch, still almost patient. I couldn't see a face, only the outline of someone standing too comfortably in the dark. My father's words from the notebook echoed, "Don't let them find it." Was this who he meant? A shadow shifted outside and the porch boards groaned. Whoever it was had moved closer, toward the door, my door. A soft knock followed. 3 slow taps, not forceful, not threatening, almost familiar, but still wrong. I clutched the notebook to my chest, every part of me torn between freezing in place and running. The knock came again, gentler, like someone who knew exactly how fear sounded on the other side of a door. I stepped back, my heart thudding against my ribs, the cabin suddenly feeling smaller than it had all day. The footsteps shifted again, 1 step backward this time, as if the person out there sensed my hesitation or my fear. The night wrapped itself tightly around the cabin, quiet, except for the faint rustle of leaves and my own uneven breathing. Another knock, just 2 taps this time. Then a voice, soft, older, wrapped in something like grief. "Mayra, I need to speak with you about your father." I froze. They knew my name. And in that instant, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. The truth waiting outside my door wasn't a stranger's story. It was my father's final thread, and it had finally found me. The last knock still echoed in the wood when I finally reached for the doorknob. My fingers were cold, not from fear exactly, but from the feeling that the world I knew was about to tilt, just slightly, just enough that nothing would sit the same again. I opened the door slowly. A frail woman stood beneath the weak porch light, her silver hair pulled into a loose knot, her hands trembling in a way that told me the shaking had been happening for years. But it wasn't her age that struck me. It was her eyes. Something about them felt familiar, like I had seen them before, looking out from a photograph pressed between the pages of a notebook. "Elira," she whispered, "your father told me I might need to find you someday." And just like that, the night seemed to breathe. I stepped aside, letting her in, though part of me felt like I was stepping into her story instead. She moved slowly, carefully, as if each step carried a memory she wasn't sure she should place on the floor. The cabin accepted her without protest. Elira glanced around the dim room, her gaze falling on the notebook lying open on the table. Something softened in her expression, pain, gratitude, maybe both wrapped together. "I wondered when you'd open it," she said quietly. We sat across from one another, a small lamp between us, casting gentle shadows that wavered with every breath. She folded her hands, took a moment, then lifted her gaze to mine. "You look like him," she murmured. "Not the way he looked on the outside. But here," she touched her chest lightly. My throat tightened. No one had spoken about my father that way in years. "What were you to him?" I asked, my voice barely louder than the lamp's hum. Her smile was small, sad around the edges. "Someone he once saved," she said. "And someone he kept saving. Until the very end." Elira leaned back, as if preparing to unspool a thread she had guarded for decades. She told me everything. The debts she had fallen into when she was young, the kind that didn't come with contracts, just consequences. The men who controlled her, the choices she didn't get to make. The day my father found her terrified and alone in a bus station 30 years ago. "He gave me money he didn't have," she said. "And then he gave me protection he couldn't afford." I listened, my hands folded in my lap, knuckles white, as she painted a picture of a man I thought I knew. She spoke of threats my father intercepted, deals he broke quietly behind closed doors, and the hidden account he created, not for himself, but for me. "For you?" I whispered. Elira nodded. He knew one day he might not be strong enough to stand between danger and the people he loved. So he created something that could. The bank card, the trust fund, the coded notes. He had been preparing me without ever telling me. "But why keep it secret?" I asked. This time she didn't smile. Her eyes darkened, older suddenly, wiser, because anyone who knew he had resources would go after them. And if they couldn't get to him, she looked at me gently, they would go after you. Silence bloomed in the small cabin, thick enough to settle in the corners. Elira reached into her coat and pulled out a small folded paper. When she handed it to me, her fingers brushed mine, cold, trembling, fragile. "This is the last thing he ever wrote," she said softly. I unfolded it. 3 simple lines, written in my father's familiar handwriting. "Mayra, when the time comes, don't be afraid to start over. Everything I hid was to help you stand where I could not." My throat tightened. The room suddenly felt too quiet. "He wanted you to have a choice," Elira continued. "A life built by your hands, not the ones that tried to control you." She glanced toward the front door, the same direction my husband. had once pushed me toward dismissing me as if my life were an inconvenience. Now you have the means to leave him behind, she said. Not as someone abandoned, but as someone beginning. Her words settled over me like a soft blanket, warm and heavy with truth. Something shifted in my chest, not anger, not grief. Something calmer, cleaner, a kind of understanding I hadn't known I'd been reaching for. The inheritance wasn't wealth. It was a warning, a shield, a path, a way out he had built long before I knew I'd need one. Elira stood eventually, her legs unsteady, but her eyes clearer than they had been when she arrived. I walked her to the porch, the night air cool around us, the sky stretching wide and quiet overhead. When you're ready, she said, the key in that box. It opens the real beginning. I didn't ask what she meant. Somehow I felt I already knew. After she left, I returned to the table and picked up the key, small, worn, warm from where I'd held it earlier. I closed my fingers around it, feeling its weight settle into my palm. For the first time since my father died, I felt something steady inside me. Not fear, not confusion, a beginning. A life he had carved quietly in the shadows, waiting. Now for me to step into the light.